Okay. So it always feels important to recognize that this phase of the morning is also its own kind of meditation. That there's an invitation to listen in a kind of embodied way so that you hear not just the words and the content, but maybe something that's behind the content. Um, and I'm going to say a lot of things, and just you'll trust that you'll remember whatever is useful and supportive. And there'll be an opportunity if you want to sign up on my mailing list. I'm going to send out a little synopsis of what I talk about today. So before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge that tonight will be a full moon, the hunter's moon, and in the Buddhist world, the full moon is a very auspicious occasion. It's said that a lot of the important events in the Buddha's life happened on full moon. He was born on the full moon. He left the palace to go into homelessness on the full moon. He was enlightened on the full moon. His first sermon was on the full moon, and his death was on the full moon. And the moon is often a symbol of enlightenment. And these teachings that we share are really just fingers pointing at that moon, that kind of beautiful and also ineffable thing that we call awakening. And because the moon actually has quite a profound effect on our physiology, in the Buddhist world, the full moon is seen as a time where people are encouraged to really turn the attention inward and kind of steward the kind of amplification that sometimes happens in the emotional realm with the full moon. And so it's quite common in these Buddhist countries for the community to gather together on a day like this and practice together. And on the full moon, often, the teacher will talk for hours and hours and go late into the evening. So buckle up. In August, I sat a 10-day concentration and retreat, and so this practice has been very much on my mind. I had a very profound experience of having a mind that was very concentrated, and so that's what I wanted to talk to you about. And so as I was saying, I think there is there's a meaningful distinction between ways of practicing. When we talk about the Vipassana or mindfulness practice, it is much more oriented around the notion of clear seeing. In fact, this word Vipassana means to cut through, to kind of cut through to see more deeply. Seeing in the broadest sense of the world that we are aware of an experience, and then we have some recognition of what that experience is. So for example, we are aware of having a body, that we can connect with parts of the body, and then we can know what's happening in that part of the body, that we can feel sensation, that tingling, vibration, pulsation, the kind of energetic qualities of the experience of the body, feeling the body from inside the body, and that we learn to recognize the patterns and constellations of experience which constitute our emotions. So we might know that like a tightening of the chest and a kind of vibratory feeling in the belly is a kind of anxiousness or restlessness. And so being aware of what we're experiencing when we're experiencing it is quite useful, and being able to make the adjustments in order to go through life more harmoniously. Another aspect of the Vipassana practice is this noticing of what is pleasant and unpleasant, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant. which turns out to be kind of a seminal way in which most of us orient our lives, like kind of moving towards the comfort, pleasant, like this, moving away from what we don't like, and maybe if it's sort of neutral, we just zone out. We also, in the Vipassana practice, becoming aware that when we are thinking, this is actually quite a insight when you first realize like how much thinking is actually happening and sort of like just the water that we swim in, so that we can notice when we're thinking, and we can also notice the content of the thoughts in a kind of way that allows us to evaluate them, so we don't just take whatever comes into the head as being true, that we actually test it against our immediate perception of reality. And that we can be aware of the attitude of the mind, the kind of filter through the mind is seeing things. So sometimes talk about a greedy mind, the mind that really wants something, or the aversive mind that's really like not wanting something. And useful to see how our experience is colored by the attitude of the mind. And in all these ways of practicing mindfulness, we can connect with that that within us, which is the experiencer or the knower of the experience. And this is a profound thing, because the mindfulness that knows anxiety is not anxious. The mindfulness that knows sadness is not sad. So it gives us a kind of different perspective on the ever-changing experiences that go through the mind. This development of this kind of intimacy with the inner experience is quite profound. And I like the quote from Zen Master Dogen, who he described enlightenment as intimacy with all things. Intimacy. So the concentration practice, on the other hand, is more oriented around the cultivation of calmness, tranquility, contentedness, acceptance. And the English word concentration maybe is not the best translation for the ancient Indian word samadhi. Concentration does have a sense of I think of like a laser, like a one-pointedness, which is part of samadhi. But when I hear the word concentration, I usually think of like being a child and being told to concentrate, which is a kind of like efforted attention. And as I was saying in the instructions, that efforted attention actually gets in the way of the mind being settled and gathered, because that effort is a kind of agitating energy. So I'm going to use the word samadhi to talk about this quality of mind, and the practice of cultivating this quality of mind is known as the shamatha practice. It's what we practice today. So there's a kind of thread in the Buddhist thinking that we have to be wary of sense desires, and this notion that we can find satisfaction in just sort of the things that please the senses. And so when the Buddha left the palace to go into homelessness, he actually started with doing these concentration practices. That was sort of the prevailing practice at the time, and got a mastery of these deep absorptive states. And the teachers at the time were sort of saying like, this is it, this is the path, this is enlightenment. And he said, well, these are great states. They're very contented and blissful and peaceful, but once you're not in the state, you're right back where you started. So there must be more. So he kept searching for a more complete kind of sense of liberation, and in that practice, it was very austere. They thought that the way to free the mind was to beat down the body. So they would contort themselves into awkward positions that they would hold for long periods of time, sitting on a bed of nails, not lying down, just standing or sitting all the time, eating very small quantities of food. It said, like a couple of grains of rice a day. And at one point, the Buddha even tried to stop breathing. Um, and so, he got quite emaciated and actually close to death. There's a sutta in which he describes pressing his belly and feeling his spine, and how he would get up from his meditation seat and he would just fall over. And then as he's kind of like on the verge of dying, he had this memory of being a child at a kind of like maybe something like a harvest festival with his father, and he just spontaneously went into one of these samadhi absorbed states and felt this profound sense of calm and peace and contentedness and well-being. And in the reflection of this, remembering of this, he realized, this kind of pleasure is not something to be afraid of. This kind of pleasure that is internally sourced, that's generated by the mind and the collectedness of the mind, and that in fact it's actually a support to awakening. And so he pivoted and actually had some rice gruel, which sounds terrible, but apparently this was the ice cream of the time. And all the other ascetics were like, oh, Gautama, he's gone soft. But then in that resolve and strength from actually eating, he was able to resolve to sit in front of the fig tree until he was awakened. So concentration and mindfulness are kind of inextricably related. You have to have at least some minimal stability of mind in order to practice mindfulness. And you have to have some modicum of awareness of what your experience is in order to practice the shamatha practice. And in fact, it's usually said that it's the development of more and more stability of mind that really supports our ability to see clearly. And the analogy that's sometimes given is that it's like if you were looking through a telescope at a very distant star. Because the star is so far away, even the slightest movement of the telescope, and you're looking at a whole different part of the sky. And the development of samadhi is like getting a tripod, which allows that telescope to be steady so you can actually see in the distance. So a mind with samadhi is a doorway to tremendous inner wealth. There's that kind of deep, abiding sense of joy, happiness, satisfaction, tranquility that is not just mental, but is also like a body experience. The mind becomes satisfied. This is like a very unusual experience where there's like a kind of just satisfaction at being alive, not needing anything to be added or taken away from the situation. Also malleable. And so you place the mind on an object and it just kind of stays there. And there's a kind of interest that is generated by the gathered mind. That's just sort of the nature of the mind that's not agitated. An undistracted mind, a mind that is at peace with itself, composed, collected, centered, steady. And there can be a shift in perspective also that happens just kind of automatically with this. So I was at this retreat I was speaking about. I was doing walking meditation practice, and if you've been on retreat, there's usually cycles of alternating sitting and walking just to support the body and support the energies. And so in the walking practice, there's kind of like there's an area at Spirit Rock where this retreat was happening, where there's kind of like it's a patio, but there are lines in the patio that sort of tell you like this is a lane. And so you walk in your lane, and it's very, you're kind of in your space, you're in your practice, and you're walking, feeling the footsteps, and really, concentrating the mind, allowing the mind to become more and more concentrated. And it's kind of an etiquette, that you pick a lane and you stay in your lane. And So I'm there, there's probably a dozen of us, and all very much, it's midway of the retreat. There's very like this sense of like settled, and everyone's really in their own space. And then this person comes just sort of meandering through, like, I don't know, just strange meandering up and down, like crossing every single person's path. And I was just noticing that one by one, every person had to adjust, and was like, what's going on? And my normal reaction to that kind of thing would be, outrage. Like, this is, we have an etiquette, we have an agreement here, you're breaking the agreement, we're here cultivating awareness, and you're completely unaware that you're like infringing on everyone's experience. Uh, and my normal state of mind would be to really like pick that up and really like wag my finger at that person and feel um, gypped. They're taking away my experience. And for some reason, my mind was so gathered and so collected that it wouldn't be agitated by that experience. And in fact, the experience that came out was just kind of hilarity at the situation, and also a kind of hilarity at the fact that in my normal state of mind, I would let that take my peace. Like, I would surrender to that agitation gladly, and because there's a kind of like energizing thing of being indignant. Um, and so this shift of perspective is just something that happened with a collected mind. It wasn't something that where I like made a calculus or had to think about it. My feeling is that when the mind is really collected and gathered, it's so pleasurable that there is a kind of instinct to protect that against at least minor agitations. That there is a kind of like, should I go there? No, I'm not going to go there. That happens on a very unconscious level. But this sense of not being concerned is not a kind of complacency or resignation. There's a kind of warmth and connectedness in this state of mind, that the natural state of the undisturbed mind is actually that we care very deeply. That's the default state. At least that's my experience of it. So sometimes I get this sense in talking to people that there's a feeling sometimes that it's not appropriate to cultivate or have a kind of sense of boundless joy and well-being because like the world is in shambles, the world is on fire, and there's so many things, global warming or like all the things that happen in our own life on a personal level, and maybe those afflictive emotions that we have, a sense of fear or heartbreak or whatever it is, are actually quite appropriate. But the question here is like a kind of negotiation of how much authority we want to give those afflictive emotions. Do we give them authority to take away our peace and our sense of well-being? Or can we feel an emotion, be aware of emotion without getting lost in it, without getting attached to it, without being blinded by it? I also sometimes hear people say that it seems selfish to kind of do this inner cultivation again when the world needs so much care. And I like what Gil Fronsdale says. He says, a mind with samadhi cannot be selfish because selfishness is a kind of fragmentation. So when the mind is integrated, we're much more in the mind that feels connected and caring and compassionate. It's almost a version of what could be a very long discussion of the Buddhist concept of emptiness, which is not empty, it's full. There's no you and me, it's just this, what we might call us. And so it's a little bit of a cliche, but I guess it's also not selfish because we really do need to put on our own oxygen masks first, because only then will we be available to help where we're needed. So a few lines from the T.S. Eliot poem Ash Wednesday. Because I know that time is always time, and place is always and only place, and what is actual only for a time, and only for a place. I rejoice that things are as they are, and I renounce the blessed face, and I renounce the voice. Teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still. So I love this phrase, teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still. Something to reflect on. So in this Samata practice, we are cultivating this notion of letting go. As I said, not picking things up, not rejecting them. Joseph Goldstein tells the story of being at a monastery in India and is practicing over an extended period of time and would get into these deeply absorbed states. And the way he reports it is like, fuck, I was on the verge of something, like I was on the verge of enlightenment. But it turned out this monastery, the food was really terrible for some reason, like if you've ever been to India, it sometimes happens, like they just don't have the things or but occasionally they would get these bananas, these sort of tropical little bananas that are really sweet and delicious. And so Joseph's telling about this story where he's in this deep concentration, this profound sense of feeling on the precipice of something, and then the announcement comes on the speaker, we have bananas today. So it's like enlightenment or bananas. Pretty much always chose the bananas. A mind with samadhi is also an antidote to a feeling of instability or transition. And this is also something that I hear from a lot of people, that the world feels like it's very unstable. The political landscape is changing like minute by minute in this country and abroad, where wars are breaking out of nowhere. The climate is having all kinds of effects, fires, storms. And then part and parcel of just being a human being in this kind of body is that we are subject to all the kinds of personal things that happen. We might have instability in our relationships or in our living arrangement or in our jobs. And this can lead to a sense of anxiety and fear and apprehensiveness, all emotions which agitate the mind. And so the samadhi practice is a very useful antidote to this feeling of scatteredness that we get when things are changing very rapidly or they feel uncertain or unsafe. And in fact, it's often said that this is one of the profound insights in the Vipassana practice, that the world is in constant flux, that it is inconstant. Sometimes people say things are always changing, and this is a very kind of liberative insight, but only if we have some sense of inner stability. Because if all our experience is like the world is just can't rely on anything, and then somebody tells you, well, things are always changing, like that's not helpful at all. It's only when we have this kind of modicum of inner stability that we can see that the fact that things are always changing is actually a freedom, because we don't have to pick them up and we don't have to reject them. The samadhi practice can help you kind of step out of your normal mode of being. We all kind of have our normal modes. Maybe the mode is like noticing all the things that are wrong with the world and either wanting to fix them, or in my case, keeping a list. Laments. And then, or maybe it's like all the things that we want, like desire, or maybe we're in a state of restlessness. Like we can kind of, but the contrast of having some cultivation or even some temporary experience of a mind that is gathered and settled and calm and not agitated gives you a kind of contrast to compare your normal mode of mind, how you might be going through life, and actually see the difference. It's not just the anxiousness or the worry or the wanting or the aversion are not just the water that we're swimming in. And the beautiful thing about the practice of cultivating samadhi is that because it generates a sense of well-being, and because the well-being supports the gathering, it's this kind of virtuous cycle. So as I was saying, one of the roadblocks to cultivating samadhi is the tendency to over-effort. And I think this is a kind of also a kind of signature way of being in the world, and sort of what I'll call like the Western way of thinking, like goal orientation and effort and strategy and plan and working hard. And here the approach is not efforting into samadhi, but systematically and patiently and gently creating the conditions which support the natural unfolding of that. So as we did in the practice, this gentle, bright effort of directing the attention at the breath, sustaining the attention at the breath, a kind of relaxed sustaining, connecting with the sense of joy and well-being that are either already there or may arise, or using a gratitude practice, or sensing into areas of the body where there is a sense of pleasure and well-being, physical comfort. And then a kind of like loyalty or commitment or dedication, this kind of like resolve to, during the period of practice, not pick anything up, not reject anything. And when we notice that we've picked something up or that we're bracing against something, to just gently let that go and begin again. A kind of also useful if we have a kind of trust, because this is a patient process. It's not a sit down and collect the mind. It's a kind of like cumulative and over time, that if we have some trust that either comes from our own experience of what it is to cultivate something, or when we don't have our own trust or faith, then we can borrow it from those that we respect and believe in, our fellow practitioners or teacher. Also, not to take too much responsibility for when this happens, because it's largely outside your control and highly dependent on conditions, even though the practice ultimately is to be independent of conditions. So being on retreat, I was able to access this state of the mind being so collected, but there's so much support for that. I don't have any responsibilities. I'm being fed. I'm being cared for. I'm not being agitated by media or reading or really any outer concern. But I think it's an important reflection to see how we can tilt the scales in our favor in daily life practice. Like, what are the things that support samadhi and what are the things that don't? And the first part of this reflection is just to notice that the mind reflects how we use it. So if we are multitasking, kind of jumping from task to task, trying to track a lot of things at one time, the mind will be scattered. In the meditative world, actually, it's said that multitasking is actually kind of a myth. It might feel like we're doing two things at one time, but the attention really can only do one thing at a time. So this multitasking is actually the process of moving back and forth, but it's so rapid that it's like a movie. It has the appearance of continuity. So if we multitask all the time, as most of us do, then we can notice that scatters the mind and strategize about ways that maybe we can um, not do that. Like I'm experimenting with some time management techniques where instead of jumping from email to word processing to phone, that I'm allotting parts of the day to those tasks and actually noticing a meaningful difference in the level of agitation that that creates. If we engage in activities that agitate the mind, like mindlessly consuming social media, sort of the same thing, this endless scroll, attention on each thing for a few seconds, it and we know this, like no one ever reported after an hour of endless scroll that they feel great. Like it's just not a thing. uh, you know, I notice that I have a lot of FOMO, so like sometimes I want to just know what's going on so I'm not missing out. But usually it's not worth it. Um, there's also this dance that I do with media news, like wanting to be a good citizen of the world and thus be somewhat informed about what's going on, and also the recognition that really the job of most media is to agitate you. Like that's how they keep you glued to the set or to the station, by creating this sense of like agitation. I love movies, so I notice that unfortunately the movies that I like the most, which are action oriented and suspenseful, are also the most agitating. And for me, it's quite subtle. Like, only when I began to practice more deeply did I notice that there's just like a slight agitation that lingers and often will even like affect my sleep, and then that creates more agitation because you're tired. Certain kind of people make you feel calm, certain kind of people make you feel agitated. Good thing to pay attention to. And so the reflection, and I mean, the list could go on and on, but I think the reflection is like, what are the things that one could renounce? What are the things that one could give up or let go of that don't support the mind being gathered, collected, peaceful, calm, at ease? And what are the things that we could do that support that? Like being around those people who make us feel calm. Another support for a collected mind is uh, practicing good sila, ethical conduct. And this is said not really in a kind of moralistic way, but really more around what the Buddha called the bliss of blamelessness. That there is a kind of relaxing that happens when you can go through the world knowing that um, you're free of blame, that you know there aren't a bunch of lies you've told that you have to keep track of and worry about who you told what, or you didn't steal something and are worried about getting discovered, and that there's a way in which we can relax. And that relaxation is, again, a supportive condition for the mind to gather and collect. Also, when we go through the world without blame, it leads to a kind of like we can feel good about ourselves, which is also supportive. And this idea that we can have like an inner wellspring of well-being um, is not only tremendously liberative for ourselves, but it's also like everyone we come in contact with, because we no longer are counting on everybody else to make us happy. That happiness and well-being is coming from here, and so all the agendas that we have in dealing with other people fall away. You actually become that person that people want to be around because you don't want anything from them. There's a story about uh, JFK on Air Force One, and apparently he was constantly complaining about the temperature. It's too hot, it's too cold, and he had a reputation for like everyone was kind of afraid of him. He was very like directive and harsh and would yell at people, and So the people in charge of that were just constantly scramming, too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold. So finally they put this dial on his desk, and they said, this is the temperature control, so you can just turn the dial. What they didn't tell him is that the dial actually wasn't connected to anything. But the story, I don't know if this is a true story, but the story goes that he was constantly fiddling with the knob, but he wasn't complaining about it. And I love this story because I feel like for much of my life I have gone through life fiddling with all the knobs. Like there's just a lot of knobs, and I'm just trying to get each level just right. And when it's just right, then last. And this connecting with something that is inner, not outer, as a profound release from that constant struggle to just get the conditions just right. And the problem is in this culture, like most of us have it pretty good. Like we can get most of the things we want. We can fiddle a lot of knobs. I can fiddle some knobs on my computer and objects show up like the same day sometimes. So it's tempting to think that that's the way, This is a poem from Mark Nepo. Having loved enough and lost enough, I am no longer searching, just opening. No longer trying to make sense of pain, but trying to be a soft and sturdy home in which real things can land. These are the irritations that rub into a pearl. So we can talk for a while, but then we must listen the way rocks listen to the sea. And we can churn at all that goes wrong, but then we must lay all distractions down and water every living seed. So Rumi has a similar... Rumi's talking about love and water, primarily, and milk, but you could substitute any of the words I used to describe Samadhi, pointing to this kind of inner treasure. So Rumi says, there's a hidden love center in human beings that you will discover and savor and nourish yourself with. This will be your food. Don't look for it outside yourself. You are the source of milk. Don't milk others. There's a milk fountain inside of you. Don't walk around with an empty basket. You have a channel into the ocean, and yet you ask for water from a little pool. There is a basket of fresh bread on your head, and yet you go door to door asking for crusts. Knock on your inner door, no other. Sloshing knee-deep in fresh river water, yet you keep wanting to drink from other people's water bags. Water is everywhere around you, but you only see the barriers that keep you from water. There's a lot of metaphors in there, but it's all kind of pointing to the same thing. That it's all here. So the last thing I wanted to say is that another way of cultivating a kind of well-being and happiness that supports the mind being at ease is the practice of generosity. Like we know that it feels good when we are generous to the things that we care about with our effort, with our money, with our attention, however we share that. And this group, as you all know, is supported on that tradition of generosity. And I actually love this. I mean, it sounds self-serving, but I actually believe that these communities were organized around the practice of generosity to give the people in the community the opportunity to experience the well-being that comes from supporting something that you care about. And we need that support. Although there are things here that do cost money, this group is offered freely. It's a nonprofit. I'm on the board, so I can tell you that your support is indispensable to the organization and is gratefully received. It supports all the things you see here, all the employees, fancy sound systems and cameras and lights and payroll and insurance, and also supports me so that I can spend more of my time doing this. So many ways to do that. We have bowls outside and a credit card machine and online. So thank you in advance for your generosity. And so we have a few minutes for some questions or comments. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk today. My question is, during Samadhi meditation, how would you transition to more mindfulness or Vipassana in that same period of time? Or are they just so similar that one bleeds into the other?
I think they are very similar. You know, some people say that like you spend the first half of your meditation gathering the mind, and second half could be more open. I am of the school of thinking that I like to pick some quality that I want to cultivate and just stick with it. The analogy I've heard before is it's like digging a well. If you dig over here a little bit, you dig over here a little bit, you dig over a little bit, you're never going to hit water. So my style of practice, since I've been practicing, is to pick a quality I want to cultivate, and then for a period of months, I just am focusing on cultivating that quality. So I spent a year just doing loving kindness meditation. The last year and a half or so, pretty much focused on concentration, just trying to. At some point, I just feel like, okay, you know, either I've reached a plateau or I've kind of like I've got this. Now it's what's next. But people have different approaches. Yes, speaking to the mic closely so that people online can hear you.
Okay, so my question is, when you talk about emptiness and not identifying with things like our relationships or our career or success, I guess my question is, what sense of self do you have? Because that's the struggle I've been having, where like, what do you base your sense of self or self-confidence and
Yeah.
yeah.
This is the great mystery, you know, like it is true that we have identities and that we care deeply about our relationships and making our mark on the world in whatever way we want. And it's also true that this lifetime is the blink of an eye in geological time, and that although you seem like a person and I seem like a person, we are 99.99% empty space. And both are true. And so, like, I think one of the things we learn to do when we practice is to live in both worlds and live according to the rules of those worlds. So, like when you're in the world, doing your work in the world, of course you care about those things. It's not that you wouldn't pick up those things or be, you know, in fact, you would pick up those things with great care and tenderness and attention. But in the space of formal meditation practice, practicing not picking up, not rejecting is building a kind of capacity. And you know, they say in Zen practice that there's just two things in life: that you practice Zazen, sitting in meditation, and then you tend the garden. But the garden is the whole world. So in that tending of the garden, I think is where we find our meaning. Whatever your way of tending the garden is, or tending to the needs of the world, or being of service. I don't know if that answered your question.
I have a similar question.
Yeah.
I have a very similar question. Related.
Yeah.
It's very related. It goes to the issue of the garden. So I'm thinking about, we're taught about non-attachment, and and I'm just thinking through that lens, what is the individual's connection to the garden, to the larger world? Does that make sense? Like, how much responsibility do we bear, especially in just these times
Yeah.
where we're living? We live in this country where things are happening every day that we almost want to disassociate. We don't want to be responsible. We want to say that as an individual, I can't stop what's happening at the border, for instance.
Yeah.
And I'm just confused about how, like, what is our responsibility to our larger world as individuals?
Yeah. I think it's something we have to decide for ourselves, but I like it's a kind of ineffable thing, and that's why I like poetry, like the lines teach us to care and not to care. I think that it's both, like that we can care deeply about each other and our environment and animals and justice, and that also not to care in the sense that we're not giving up our internal freedom, that we're not disconnecting from an inner sense of well-being, from the joy of actually just being alive. Like there is a kind of, like when you can connect with it, a kind of just pleasure in just that this thing is alive, that there's some balance there. Yeah. All right, thank you all for coming. One more question? Yeah.
We mentioned Vipassana, Samadhi, and then there's
Shamatha. The shamatha practice is the cultivation of samadhi.
okay.
Yeah. All right, thank you all for coming. Sorry I'm out of time.
Thank you.